Hey guys, tonight we will follow the footsteps of a king both revered and feared, Henry VIII, the man who turned marriage into a political instrument, religion into a stepping stone of power, and left behind a legacy both magnificent and merciless. Blood and power, these twin forces built the thriving Tudor Empire, yet also consumed his very flesh. In the bitter winter of 1547, Henry VIII was no longer the proud sovereign, but trapped in a rotting body that had once symbolized strength, now reduced to relentless agony and a haunting stench. And few realize that behind that odor lies a tale of inhuman authority waiting to be revealed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment below to let me know where you are and what time it is there now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Henry VIII, the most infamous monarch in English history, ended his life in near endless misery. In the bitter cold of the winter of 1547, he lay bedridden, his body swollen, festering, and emitting such a foul stench that even his courtiers were overwhelmed. The horrific ulcers on his legs continually oozed blood and pus, forcing the royal physicians to use mechanical pulleys just to move the colossal king. Although his flesh had become a prison betraying the very strength once admired, in Henry's mind there still lingered ambition and hatred. He continued to issue orders to punish his enemies, executing those who had once enjoyed his absolute trust. Henry Tudor was born on the 28th of June in 1491 at Greenwich, the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. In his youth, Prince Henry was regularly tutored in the classics, poetry, swordsmanship, and horsemanship. Although he was not the original heir, that role belonged to his older brother. Arthur Fate made Henry the prince after Arthur's death in 1502. From an early age, he displayed leadership qualities, intelligence, pride, and a certain recklessness. In 1509, at the age of just 17, Henry officially ascended the throne following his father's death. His reign ushered in a prosperous era. Palaces were renovated, humanist culture flourished, and diplomatic ties with continental Europe were strengthened. Henry VIII enjoyed music, poetry, and sports. He composed music, wrote a poem for his first queen, Catherine of Aragon, and took part in splendid jousting tournaments. Under his rule, England gradually asserted itself, notably through the creation of a powerful navy and the fortification of its coastlines. However, alongside his great contributions to the nation, Henry VIII also left behind many scandals. He endured 6 highly controversial marriages, including 2 annulments by royal decree, and at least 3 of his 6 wives executed. His divorce from Catherine of Aragon ignited his break with the Holy See, leading to the founding of the Church of England. This decision not only fundamentally changed the religious nature of the realm, but also paved the way for the dissolution of the monasteries, enriching the royal treasury, and sparking the large-scale Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion in the north. Tales of his cruelty and oppressive rule spread far and wide, causing many to shudder at the mention of his name, recalling hasty executions and the ever-present threat. In his personal life, Henry VIII was the father of 3 legitimate children: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Mary and Elizabeth later became 2 powerful queens, but their childhoods were far from peaceful. They witnessed their mother's fall from favour and grew up in an atmosphere of alternating triumph and peril. Edward, the sole son, became heir after Henry's death, ascending the throne at the age of 9 and ushering in a challenging regency period. Before his final days, Henry remained busy with state affairs. He pushed for legal reforms, supervised the construction of coastal fortresses, and enacted numerous customs laws to increase revenue. He also devoted much effort to building projects, including the magnificent Whitehall Palace. Once the radiant centre of power, Yet every action taken for the nation's benefit bore a harsh imprint: the arbitrary use of his power to suppress opposition, and the willingness to employ capital punishment to silence any doubt or rebellion. Serious illness, diabetes, gout, and bone infections combined into a poison that gnawed at Henry VIII's flesh and bone. Every step, no matter how small, became a torment, forcing him to be dragged from room to room. The king's decline did not stop at the physical. His nerves were eroded by paranoia and uncontrollable rage. The signs of death grew clearer. Blood-tinged fluid seeped from the funeral bier, and rumours spread of jackals and stray dogs licking golden-brown puddles on the palace floor, as if delivering fate's merciless judgment. Despite wielding absolute power, Henry VIII could not triumph over life and death. Before he breathed his last, he devoted most of his remaining strength to securing his legacy, severing ties with Rome, founding the Church of England, dissolving the monasteries, and ensuring the succession for his only son, Edward. On the morning of the 28th of January in 1547, his 55th birthday, Henry VIII drew his final breath at Whitehall. His body, though sealed in a lead coffin, swelled, burst, and leaked fluids everywhere, leaving behind a horrifying testament to the price of power pushed beyond all limits. Right now, let us gently slow our pace in the dead of night, light a candle in remembrance, and together explore the mysterious journey from the illustrious Prince of Greenwich to the powerful throne of Henry VIII, where glory and tragedy intertwine with every breath. Henry Tudor entered the world on the 28th of June in 1491 at Greenwich Palace, the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. As an infant, he was not destined to rule his elder brother. Arthur was heir apparent, but fate intervened in 1502 when Arthur died, thrusting 10-year-old Henry into the role of heir. Overnight, his life shifted from carefree youth, filled with lessons in Latin, horsemanship, and heraldry, to one governed by the weight of dynastic expectation. By 1509, upon the death of his father, 17-year-old Henry ascended the throne amid great fanfare. Imagine the scene: torches flickering in Westminster Abbey, trumpeters heralding his coronation, and a new king dressed in regal crimson and ermine, every eye fixed on his tall, athletic frame and flaming red-gold hair. European ambassadors gushed over his symmetry, and bearing few princes rivaled his looks or his appetite for sport. He jousted with gusto, hunted deer through the royal forests, and presided over lavish feasts that echoed with music and poetry. Under his youthful rule, England entered a golden age. Royal architecture flourished as he renovated palaces and expanded the court's cultural patronage. Scholars from Oxford and Cambridge exchanged ideas in candlelit chambers under his patronage. He commissioned painted portraits that conveyed both his princely elegance and his eager intellect. Coastal fortifications rose along the Channel, and his nascent navy's ships dipped their sails for the first time on the tides of England's future maritime power. Yet even in these halcyon days, the seeds of tragedy were sown. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, arranged to secure an alliance with Spain, initially seemed a promising union. But as the years passed without a male heir, Henry's confidence soured into obsession. Court whispers spoke of his infatuation with Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting whose wit and charm inflamed his desires. The young king's impatience with papal authority and his yearning for a son would soon lead him into conflict with Rome itself. Behind the splendour, the palace corridors grew rife with intrigue. Courtiers jockeyed for favour, forging alliances or plotting downfalls in the blink of an eye. Henry's disregard for caution turned audacity into recklessness. One moment, the beloved prince of a burgeoning Renaissance court. The next, a monarch willing to imprison or execute those who crossed him. Anne Boleyn's swift rise to queenship, and her equally swift fall from grace in 1536, revealed the dark underbelly of Henry's ambition. By the time he married 6 times in pursuit of dynastic security, the glittering promise of his early reign had given way to an era of fear and ruthlessness. Yet even as the shadow of his later years loomed, the foundations he laid for a strong navy, a centralized administration, and a court that celebrated learning endured long after his death. In 1536, at the age of 44, Henry decided to prove once more that age and infirmity could not diminish his prowess. He entered the lists for a grand tilting tournament at Greenwich, fully clad in polished armour that gleamed under the summer sun. Courtiers and commoners alike gathered to witness the spectacle. Trumpets blared, banners snapped in the breeze, and the heavy thud of hooves echoed on the soft turf. Though he had begun to feel the first pangs of his failing health, aching joints, dwindling stamina, Henry's pride would not allow him to stand aside. He insisted that no man, whether prince or pauper, would question his courage or his right to the field. Alas, fate is often unkind to the proud. As his heavily armoured charger thundered toward its mark, its forelegs struck an unseen rut in the ground. The horse faltered, pitching Henry headlong into the hard earth. Time itself seemed to halt as witnesses watched. The great king lay motionless, the bright pageantry fading into a hush of panic. He remained unconscious for 2 hours, until servants and physicians managed to bear him to the royal pavilion. When he finally opened his eyes, the vibrant monarch they remembered had vanished, replaced by a man whose body and spirit would never again know unbroken strength. The wound on his right leg was severe beyond measure. It pierced deep into muscle and bone, festering into a putrid ulcer that refused to close. The Tudor physicians, armed with leeches, forceps, and a handful of herbal poultices, laboured day and night, draining the wound and applying poultices of honey, vinegar, and plant extracts. Yet every remedy fell short. The ulcer festered, exuding a foul odour that turned the grand corridors of Greenwich into a stench-filled jail. Courtiers learned to mask their revulsion handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, eyes averted, stomachs clenched against waves of nausea. No tapestry or perfumed cushion could hide the rank smell that haunted every corner of the palace. Henry's mobility deteriorated rapidly. Once he strode confidently through banquet halls and council chambers, now he relied on a contraption of pulleys and ropes, a skeletal scaffold of iron and leather to hoist him from bed to chair, from chamber to audience room. Gentlemen-at-arms and loyal servants formed a human litter, carrying him between appointments so that state affairs could proceed without interruption. Each journey was an ordeal of slow, careful movement, punctuated by soft grunts of pain as the ulcer throbbed and pulsed within its dark cavity. The physical torment wrought a profound psychological toll. Modern scholars have speculated that the violent impact of the fall may have caused a traumatic brain injury, exacerbating Henry's predisposition toward suspicion and rage. Where once he had been a charismatic patron of poets and philosophers, he became prone to sudden fits of fury and bouts of depression. His letters from this period betray a mind plagued by doubt, fearful of conspiracies, haunted by nightmares, convinced that courtiers once dear to him were plotting his demise. He lashed out at perceived slights with terrifying swiftness. Within months of the accident, Henry's newfound ruthlessness was on full display. Anne Boleyn, his second wife and the woman whose intrigue had helped spark the split with Rome, found herself accused of adultery, incest, and high treason. The trial was brief, the verdict foregone. In May of 1536, Anne was led to the block on Tower Green, her final plea drowned in the murmurs of a court desperate to please a king grown cruel. The speed of her fall from queen to condemned woman in mere weeks shocked Europe and underscored the extent to which Henry's judgment had darkened. In the wake of Anne's execution, Henry's court grew tense and silent. No one dared look too long at the king's swollen face, or the bandaged leg he tried vainly to hide beneath velvet cloaks. Meetings that once hummed with debate now ended in awkward silences. Ministers, once confident in their advice, tread lightly, speaking only when spoken to. The king's demands became more erratic at times. He ordered the immediate confinement of nobles, At others, he insisted upon new feasts or jousts, as if trying to reclaim the vigour he feared he had lost forever. The leg wound showed no mercy. Even as the seasons changed, the ulcer remained a source of constant agony. The skin around it blackened, then peeled, then regrew only to break open again. In winter, the cold seeped into his bones, intensifying the pain until he could scarcely speak. In summer, sweat and humidity fed the infection, turning bandages into breeding grounds for insects and maggots. His nights were sleepless, filled with fevered dreams of betrayal and blood. Yet Henry continued to rule with an iron will. He pressed Parliament to pass laws that further centralised power in the monarchy, and he appointed governors to oversee his expanding overseas interests. He wrote letters to the French king, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope, though his correspondence grew increasingly imperious, laced with threats rather than diplomatic finesse. The very authorities he once courted now feared him more than they respected him. By the late 1530s, Henry had married for the third time, seeking the security of a male heir, but the court whispered that this marriage, too, would end in disappointment or worse. His health and temper were both on a downward spiral, and few could say whether the throne would pass peacefully to the next generation or plunge into chaos. In these years, the image of Henry VIII transformed irrevocably. The youthful, golden-haired prince, who once lit up Tudor portraits, gave way to a man consumed by pain and paranoia. His palace, once a beacon of Renaissance culture, it felt like a fortress besieged by unseen enemies. The roar of the tilting lists was replaced by the hushed crawling of chamberlains and the soft, dreadful drip of pus into chamber pots. Thus unfolded the cruel chapter of Henry's life, when the glory of youth crashed against the harsh reality of a broken body and a fractured mind. The tournament field at Greenwich had been his stage for spectacle and acclaim. The same field witnessed his undoing, the moment when flesh betrayed the crown, and in the quiet aftermath, a cautionary tale emerged that even the mightiest sovereign is vulnerable to the frailty of a single misstep, and that the sharp edge of power can cut its wielder just as swiftly as any lance. After the accident, Henry VIII's mobility dwindled almost to nothing. His once trim waist, measured at only 89 centimetres in his youth, expanded to more than 130 centimetres. His weight swelled past 180 kilograms. Activities he had once adored, jousting in full armour, thrilling hunts through deer-studded forests, became distant memories. He could not climb the grand staircases of Whitehall without the aid of a crude pulley system. Ropes and counterweights, doing the work his weakening legs refused to bear. Even the simplest stroll from one chamber to the next was an undertaking, orchestrated by pages and guards who would gather at his bedchamber door, ready to lift him onto a wheeled sledge or into a leather sling, slung from rafters above. A foul ulcer on his thigh refused to heal. It seeped blood and pus into the linen bandages that wrapped his leg, saturating them until they clung like sodden cloth. The stench was inescapable, a rancid cloud that drifted after him through halls and courts. Visitors would hesitate at doorways, hands pressed to their noses, stomachs clenched against rising nausea. Even the bravest courtiers learned to steel themselves into silent compliance rather than risk the king's wrath by showing discomfort. As his body failed him, so too did Henry's faith in humanity and in himself. The king, who once welcomed counsel from learned men, now retreated into isolation. His court became a huddle of whispered rumours and furtive glances. For Henry had grown paranoid. He imagined plots in every shadowed corner, seeing traitors where none existed. His hot temper, once tempered by youthful vigour, now flared at the slightest perceived disrespect. A curt bow, a delayed curtsy, even a queasy cough could draw down a royal decree of execution. Among the earliest to fall were Sir Thomas More and Lord Thomas Cromwell, two men whom Henry had once counted among his closest advisers. More's refusal to endorse the king's break from Rome and Cromwell's later failure to secure a marriage he favoured provoked Henry's infamous ire. one after another. These stalwart counsellors found themselves condemned for treason or heresy, swiftly tried and even more swiftly executed. Their deaths served as grim reminders that Henry's suspicions knew no bounds, and that loyalty could offer no shield against royal suspicion. Yet, in the midst of his physical decline and merciless purge of friends, Henry clung to one enduring passion: food. His banquet grew ever more lavish, with spiced meats, onion pastries, and flagons of strong ale and sweet wines laid out upon tables, so long they spanned entire halls. Courtiers who once gathered for intellectual debate now shuffled forward, trays in hand, offering the king platter upon platter of roast fowl, glazed the hem, and intricately decorated confections. The household physicians begged him to reduce his intake, warning of clogged vessels and festering wounds. But Henry refused. To him, food was not merely sustenance, but a symbol of power, proof that even in sickness, he could command abundance. With each feast, his waistline tightened further. His doublet had to be let out. His hose required new cuts. The royal tailors became clandestine assistants in his expanding imprisonment. The more he indulged, the more his ulcer throbbed, the more pus it produced, and the more his trusted healers despaired at their inability to staunch the infection. Some nights, the beckoning glow of torches would reveal maggots wriggling in the bandages, a grotesque testament to the king's festering flesh. Yet to draw attention to such horrors was to invite danger. Any servant who dared mention the smell or the flies risked banishment. Or worse, a charge of diminishing royal dignity. In those dark days, the image of Henry as a mighty champion gave way to that of a man trapped within a body he no longer recognized. He sat upon his throne like a fallen statue, draped in silks and furs meant to conceal the swelling masses beneath. His crown, once like a halo of gold and jewels, now felt as heavy as the weight of his own mortality. Courtiers approached with measured steps, murmuring obeisances, and offering words of flattery no longer whispered with genuine reverence, but delivered under the pall of fear. As autumn turned to winter, his legs also turned to a blackened mass, impervious to every salve they applied. The physicians, at their wits' end, resorted to cauterization. Red-hot irons seared the flesh in a desperate attempt to burn away infection. Henry tolerated the agony in silence, his face set in grim determination. If his body would betray him, he would at least show that his will remained unbroken. Yet even iron wills can falter. The constant pain frayed his nerves, leaving him prone to fits of tears or sudden laughter with no apparent cause. He began to speak of death as a friend rather than a foe, murmuring prayers, not for victory but for release. The great Lion of England, whose roar once commanded armies, now whispered frightened pleas in the stench-laden night, longing for the end of his suffering. Thus the glory of his early years, the proud stride into Westminster, the robust laughter in the hunt, the handsome portrait gazing down from gallery walls became relics of a distant memory. In their place stood a cautionary silhouette, a sovereign ensnared by his own appetites, his own fears, and the merciless decay of flesh. And so the Tudor court, which once shone like a beacon of culture and might, dimmed to a chamber of hushed dread, the echo of Henry's muttered decrees, lingering like the ghosts of a once great dream. By the time Henry reached his 5th marriage, his body lay heavy with pain, and his spirit teetered on the brink of despair. Catherine Howard, barely a teenager when she first captured his eye, seemed to breathe new life into his court. For a fleeting moment, the corridors of Whitehall rang with laughter once more as she danced at banquets and sweetly curtsied before her king. Yet the reprieve proved tragically short-lived. In the spring of 1549, barely 2 years into their union, Catherine was arrested on charges of adultery accusations, whispered to have been drummed up by courtiers eager to regain favour. Her trial moved swifter than any feast, and within days she was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. her youthful voice swallowed by the hush of onlookers. Despite the horror of Catherine's fall, Henry's pursuit of dynastic security remained undiminished. In the wake of that grim spectacle, he turned his thoughts to Catherine Parr, an erudite woman known for her learning and composure. She became his sixth wife, marrying him in the late summer of 1550, when he was well into his late 50s, and she in her early 30s. Catherine Parr proved a steady companion. She soothed his fevered anxieties with gentle counsel, read aloud passages from devotional books to calm his agitated spirit, and oversaw his household with efficiency that spared no one from her quiet vigilance. However, she also safeguarded her own life by walking a careful line, never overstepping her role as queen, yet quietly influencing the king's temper and holding firm to her Protestant convictions in a court still bristling with religious tension. Henry's marriages had become more than personal alliances. They were instruments of statecraft. Each wedding reconfigured the tapestry of European politics, shifting alliances from Spain to France. From the Holy Roman Empire to the Low Countries, his nuptials dictated which foreign ambassadors sat at his table and which noble families flourished or fell in his court. When Anne of Cleves arrived from Germany in 1539, her marriage to Henry was hailed as a strategic move to secure an alliance with the Lutheran princes. Yet the union was annulled after 6 brief months. Reportedly because Henry found her unappealing, Anne emerged astonishingly untouched by the lethal fates of his other wives, retiring instead to a comfortable residence with the courtesy title the King's Sister. Yet for every treaty signed at court, every grand procession through London streets, there lay a tale of heartbreak or betrayal. N. Boleyn, who had encouraged Henry's break with Rome, was executed on charges. Most historians now deem manufactured. Jane Seymour, his third wife, died in childbirth after giving him his long-awaited son, Edward, only to be mourned in a sorrow deeper than any banquet hall could hold. Each marriage etched its mark on Henry's legacy, a testament to his relentless will and the human cost of wielding that will without restraint. Amid this carousel of alliances, Henry never relinquished his final acts of political genius or folly. Depending on one's view, he ensured that the Church of England stood on firm legal ground, declaring himself supreme head by an Act of Parliament in 1533. He dissolved the monasteries, seizing their vast lands and treasures to refill the royal coffers, a move that drastically augmented the crown's wealth, but left a spiritual vacuum in the countryside. In the bonds of his letters patent, he named his only male heir, Prince Edward, as successor and laid out detailed instructions for the young king's regency council. These documents, sealed and hidden, were meant to secure England's future long after Henry himself had departed the mortal coil. Yet no earthly plan could quell the torment that racked Henry's final months. He oscillated between triumphant visions of a reformed church, of a nation under his sole spiritual and temporal authority, and despairing prayers for mercy. His confessor's chamber was visited more frequently than his council room. His nights were haunted by fears of eternal damnation and by memories of friends and counsellors sent to the block. Accounts from attendants tell of the king bowing his head for hours in the flicker of candlelight, eyes closed in fervent supplication, only to startle upright with a murmur of paranoia, convinced that some courtier's whisper carried the plot of his undoing. In those twilight days, Henry's mind and body wrestled a final, pitiless duel. The palace staff tiptoed through passageways, anxious not to disturb his reverie or to awaken his ire with the scent of unclean flesh. Physicians attended him around the clock, checking pulses, applying ointments, and offering updated remedies that promised little more than temporary relief. Yet as the ulcer on his thigh swelled and the infection spread, even the most avowed skeptics whispered of divine retribution, or at least the inescapable reckoning of a man whose reach had far outstripped his grasp. Amid the clang of royal gates and the rustle of expensive tapestries, the world outside pressed on. Parliament passed measures to clarify Edward's future reign. Merchants in London tallied debts owed to the crown. Farmers in the realm wondered if the king's great matter would one day bring peace or further unrest. Yet inside Henry's chambers, time seemed to slow, each breath a struggle, each moment a reminder that even a king is mortal. And so, into that weary hush of late autumn 1556, Henry VIII poured the last of his strength. He remained a sévère, master of his realm, though, at what cost? Only the ghosts of Westminster Abbey could recite. In the final flicker of a candlelit vigil, the once vigorous Tudor sovereign lay beset by ailments of body and spirit, longing for an end to the agony, and for a hope that his turbulent legacy might one day be tempered by the reign of his son. This was the twilight of Henry's reign, a complex weave of ambition and remorse, of visionary reform and ruthless expediency. As the pulleys and the pages carried him from chamber to chamber, he embodied the paradox of monarchy itself, glorious in its promise, lonely in its burdens, and ultimately at the mercy of forces greater than any crown or scepter could command. After the disastrous tournament fall, Henry VIII grew more tyrannical than ever. From 1536 to the twilight of his days, his sudden fits of rage became a waking nightmare for all who served him. Whispers across the court warned that even a soft murmur of dissent could lead to the block. Gentlemen-at-arms and privy councillors, who had once laughed alongside the youthful king men like Sir Thomas More and Lord Thomas Cromwell, found themselves stripped of titles, accused of treason, and sentenced to death. The halls of Whitehall echoed no longer with debate, but with the tense hush of courtiers who knew that, in Henry's presence, silence was safety itself. Politically, England's proud institutions crumbled beneath his iron will. The immense wealth seized from dissolved monasteries padded the royal coffers and financed Henry's lavish tastes. Yet it also sowed deep resentment among the common folk. In 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace, an uprising born of loyalty to old religious houses and protest against confiscations, erupted across the north. Thousands marched under banners of the Blessed Virgin, hoping to reclaim their spiritual heritage. Henry's response was merciless. His forces crushed the insurrection with fire and sword. Priests and peasants alike faced the noose or exile, leaving scars of bitterness that would never fully heal those green pastures and grey abbeys. Even as his body weakened, propped up by doctors and a network of pulleys, the king refused to relinquish a single scrap of authority. He appointed his son Edward as heir, but not without carefully binding the succession to his own designs. Between October and December of 1546, he summoned Parliament in rapid succession to pass statutes that cemented his dual role as temporal sovereign and spiritual head of the Church of England. In those sessions, long-gowned lawyers and stiff-collared bishops trembled at his decree. Henry would be both king and supreme ecclesiastical governor, empowered to dictate the fate of every man, woman, and institution under his crown. As winter settled in, paranoia took deeper root in the royal mind. Henry installed spies in every antechamber, turnkeys in every gallery, and ordered secret monitoring of private audiences. Even the most innocent of banquets became displays of power. Silver platters piled high with roasted fowl, and sweetmeats turned into stages where courtiers dared not avert their gaze, lest the scent of his festering ulcer be mistaken for an affront. Attendants forced smiles as they listened to the king deliver judgments, fearing that any sign of disgust at the miasma hanging about him could end their careers or their heads. Within the marble walls, Henry's illness and omnipotence formed a singular horror. His body, ravaged by ancient wounds and overindulgence, wept foul-smelling ichor that seeped into his sleeping chamber's tapestries. Yet his voice resounded through corridors more commanding than ever before, issuing mandates on religious doctrine, land grants, and matters of life and death alike. Every decree carried the echo of his decaying flesh, as if the rotting ulcer at the heart of his leg were a dark metaphor for the corruption he spread across church and state. And always, the spectre of death hovered, Courtiers who once relaxed in the king's favour now gingerly drafted petitions, careful to flatter his swollen pride and to promise unwavering loyalty, even in his final months. Henry drafted elaborate wills and proclamations. Determined that his legacy would outlive his mortal shell, he rewrote statutes to exclude any who might challenge young Edward's claim, and composed devotional treatises that alternated between triumphalist doctrine and penitent confession. In his feverish prayers, he oscillated between exultation at his spiritual supremacy and terror at the thought of divine judgment, confessing sins in one breath and issuing edicts in the next. Thus, the royal court became, paradoxically, both prison and pulpit, a place where absolute power and relentless decay intertwined. The once vibrant chambers, echoing with music and scholarship, grew hushed and perfumed by fear and disinfectant. The manicured gardens lay silent, their fountains trickling beneath the shadow of Whitehall's stone walls. In these final chapters, Henry VIII ruled over a realm reshaped by his ruthless policies and haunted by the memory of his own destruction. In that sombre dusk of his reign, the world beyond the palace gates pressed on markets thrived. Shepherds tended flocks, and scholars in distant universities debated theology and law. But inside Henry's inner sanctum, time seemed to pause, measured only by the drip of pus from his ulcer and the soft, relentless scratching of quills on parchment. This was the twilight of a king whose brilliance and brutality had forged a nation, but had also revealed the tragic cost of power, untamed a prison of power, where no soul dared speak freely, and where every breath carried the stink of decay. At the beginning of 1547, King Henry VIII's body had all but given way to decline. His physicians recorded a catalogue of ailments, diabetes that plagued his blood with unending thirst, acute gout that struck his joints like molten iron, a festering necrotic ulcer that refused to heal, signs of failing heart, his pulse feeble beneath the physician's fingers, and even the ravages of kidney disease that left him restless at night. His flesh swelled in grotesque contortions. He could no longer lie upon a flat pallet but required a specially inclined bed, rigged with a system of ropes and pulleys to hoist him into position without racking agony. Each movement was an ordeal, and the toll of relentless pain rendered him silent and withdrawn, shunning even the brightest countenance of court. In those final weeks, Henry scarcely stirred from his chamber. His breathing grew laboured, as though each gasp were a wrestle for life itself. His speech faltered into halting murmurs. At times he drifted into delirium, crying out to God or whispering names, long-gone accusers, confessor, fallen friends. The royal edicts forbade any mention of the sovereign's nearing end. No courtier dared speak of death or illness in his presence. The household fell into a rhythm governed entirely by the king's bedside pages tiptoed through corridors. Courtiers arranged schedules around his pulse, and the royal physicians convened in low voices, their faces shadowed with worry. In this endless mill of sand, the palace seemed suspended, as if the world beyond its walls had forgotten to turn. Yet even as his body faltered, Henry's mind remained gripped by anxieties of legacy and succession. He summoned his legal advisers, learned men in velvet gowns, to pore over documents of marriage settlements and statutes of inheritance. By candlelight in the still hours of the night, they revised clauses, redrafted paragraphs, and quibbled over welter of technicalities. His final will allotted primacy to his only son, Edward, ensuring that the young prince would inherit the crown unchallenged. Yet Henry also included provisions for his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, stipulating dowries, titles, and safeguards against deprivation. He feared that without clear, unambiguous terms, the realm might tear itself apart in civil strife after his passing. The courtiers, privy to these deliberations, understood that no testament could ever capture the full complexity of dynastic politics, especially when its author lay fevered and frail. Through all this, Henry found scarce comfort, save in the devotion of his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, She tended him as both queen and nurse, ministering to his every need with quiet fortitude. Each morning she saw to his broken limb, changing drenched bandages and applying ointments to ease the burning pain. At mealtime, she coaxed him to sip broth, guiding the cup with a gentle hand, lest the slightest tremor spill precious liquid. When night descended, she read to him from devotional texts, her calm voice a balm against the ceaseless whirl of his thoughts. Yet she, too, endured the stench of his wounds, the groans that rippled through his tortured sleep, and the ever-present fear that one misstep might trigger royal displeasure. Their bond, forged in the crucible of suffering, was bound by duty and fear. More than affection, every word she spoke was measured. Mindful of the king's vulnerable nerve, despite her compassionate care, Catherine could not shield him from his own obsessions. He fretted over the spiritual fate of his soul and the earthly fate of his dynasty in equal measure. One moment he would issue orders to Parliament to confirm Edward's succession. The next, he would beseech a confessor to absolve him of sins he barely remembered committing. His prayers alternated between boasts of his achievements founding a national church, vanquishing Rome's influence, and pleas for mercy that trembled with guilt. Attendants whispered of his hoarse voice raised in impromptu hymn, only to crack with lamentations of existential dread. All the while, the world beyond Whitehall pressed on ambassadors, waited for tokens of favour. Merchants tallied new taxes laid upon cloth and wine, while distant relatives vied for positions in a court now governed by legal minutiae and the shifting favour of a dying king. Yet for Henry, the future belonged to Edward alone. He tasked trusted scribes with ensuring the young prince's guardians would act without bias or greed. He penned letters, sealed and sent to loyal nobles, instructing them to rally behind the Tudor heir for the peace of this realm. As he wrote, "Let none delay." At times, Catherine's gentle presence brought a fleeting peace to Henry's tormented nights. He would rest his head upon her embroidered sleeve and murmur a reluctant thanks. His breath, a shallow whisper, but the silence between them was always fraught. Neither dared speak of the inevitable, and each knew that love in those final days was overshadowed by duty and dread. The tapestries on the walls, once bright with heraldic emblems, seemed to fade into sombre greys in the lantern light, reflecting the pall that hung over the chamber. So it was, in the quiet dawn of January 1547, that Henry VIII lay poised between life and legacy. His body, ravaged by disease, groaned beneath the silken sheets. His mind, burdened by remorse and ambition, drifted through memories of triumph and terror. The only constant in those waning hours was Catherine, by turns comforter, and steward, her steady hand guiding the rhythms of a monarch's last vigil. And as the ropes and pulleys of his inclined bed held firm against the weight of his swollen flesh, the court waited, hushed, for the shallow exhalation that would signal the end of an era. In the night bridging the 27th and 28th of January in the year 1547, a dense haze of incense curled through the candlelit chambers of Whitehall Palace. Beneath tapestries heavy with the weight of Tudor heraldry, Henry VIII lay hushed upon his inclined bed, the ropes and pulleys holding him aloft in a last testament to his waning strength. Attendants drifted through the chamber in solemn procession, a line of courtiers shrouded in sable silks, their heads bowed as though pressed under some great invisible burden. The hush was absolute, broken only by the soft crackle of the amber flames and the measured footfalls of pages patrolling the corridor. As the hours deepened and the hush lengthened, Henry's breath grew ever feebler. Each inhale came as though drawn through a straw, each exhale a faint sigh of surrender. The physicians, pale and trembling, kept vigil at his bedside, fingers poised over his wrist to count the fading pulse. Nearby, Catherine Parr knelt in quiet prayer. To her gown, a pool of darkest velvet beneath her. At last, when that final flutter of life stilled, the chamber erupted in a muffled clamour of grief and relief. professed one and the same. Men and women wept behind gloved hands, their tears staining embroidered sleeves, yet decorum demanded that they maintain the stiff-backed posture of royal etiquette, and so they bowed their heads in unison, allowing no gasp or sob to breach the solemn protocol of a sovereign's end. At dawn's first pale light, the dead king's body was prepared for its journey. His limbs, now as still as stone, were dressed in finery he would never wear again. The silks drawn taut over a chest, stripped of breath. Then came the lead coffin, its interior lined with cloth of gold and velvet, the lid sealed with wax bearing the royal cipher. The coffin was hoisted from the chamber upon the shoulders of silent bearers, who carried it through echoing halls. Torches sputtered in the frosty air of the palace courtyard, and the guard of honour stood rigid as marble statues. Yet the procession to Sion Abbey, the first waypoint on the road to Windsor, became a grim spectacle none could have foreseen. The coffin, swollen by the rigours of funeral rites and the heat within, groaned beneath its seals. A fetid cloud seemed to rise from its seams, and by the time the cortege reached the abbey gate, the smell had grown unbearably strong. Witnesses spoke later of how the iron seals parted with a sickening crack, and how dark fluid seeped in rivulets down the coffin's sides, pooling onto the cobblestones. Stray dogs, once chased away by guards, lapped at the ooze, their tongues lolling in slow, grisly desperation. Gasps and curse-suppressed exclamations rippled through the assembly. Yet no soul dared approach closely enough to intervene. Instead, they murmured prayers from a distance, as though fearful that the taint might leak from the king's flesh into their very souls. Despite these unseemly horrors, the chroniclers of the Tudor court strove for dignity. Official proclamations extolled Henry as the great architect of the English Reformation, defender of the realm, patron of learning and the arts. They lauded his courage, commemorated his victories, and insisted upon the grandeur of his final rites. Yet behind closed doors and in hushed taverns, common folk and courtiers alike whispered a darker refrain that the mighty monarch had perished in a prison of his own corrupted flesh. A hunted beast, trapped within an iron cage of bone, that image of a once formidable king reduced to a bloated, rotting husk etched itself into collective memory. A grim parable of power turned upon itself. The funeral cortege resumed its journey the following morning. Winding through the sleeping streets of London, the salt damp air carried the faint stink of death, which drifted like a pall over the waking city. Men in simple wool cloaks crossed themselves at the sight of the black-plumed hearse. Women at wells paused their morning chores to bow in silent reverence or fear. No children played in the lanes that day, and no market cries pierced the gloom. The only sound was the hollow tramp of boots on stone and the distant tolling of massed bells. When the procession reached Windsor Castle, the castle gates swung open to admit the dishonoured corpse. Inside the walls, preparations awaited the chapter house. Its floor swept clean, lined with tapestries depicting saints in triumph. Priests in snowy finery chanted the office of the dead as the coffin was lowered into the crypt beneath St. Geoff's, George's chapel. There, in the cool, dim recesses, where tombs of kings past stood in silent vigil, Henry VIII's body took its final resting place beside Jane Seymour, the Queen who had given him his much-desired son. No lavish canopy of state silk hung above his tomb, for the artisans tasked with his monument had long since departed or perished. In place of grand marble lay a simple slab, a testament to disrupted plans and the fading of a king's last glory. Some said the monument's incompletion was fitting, a mirror of Henry's own unfinished business, a realm forever changed by his reforms, yet left to grapple with the unrest and rivalries he had sown. Thus ended the mortal journey of Henry VIII, a sovereign who had roared across the courts of Europe, only to be silenced by his own ravaged body. His death, both intimate and grotesque, to become legend, a reminder that crowns, however gilded, rest upon shoulders as mortal as any. In the hush that followed, England stood poised at the brink of uncertain succession. Young Edward would ascend to the throne, guided by a council wary of power's perils. And though Henry's flesh lay in the crypt beneath Windsor, the reverberations of his reign, reformation and rupture, fear and fervour would echo through the annals of history, a somnolent warning that might and mercy often tangle in the same unsteady hand. Immediately following the sombre funeral rites, the levers of power in England passed from the silent corpse of the late king into the hands of the Regency Council. At its head stood Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, maternal uncle to young King Edward VI, who had just celebrated his 9th birthday. Somerset assumed the role of Lord Protector, effectively guiding the realm on behalf of the child monarch. Yet almost before the dust of the funeral procession had settled on the streets of London, rifts began to appear within the council's ranks. One faction coalesced around the cause of Protestant reform, eager to press forward with the religious changes initiated under the late Henry VIII. These men clergy who had embraced the new prayer book, parliamentarians who saw economic advantage in dissolving further church lands, pushed Somerset to enact laws that would further erode the old Catholic liturgy. Their voices were calm and reasoned, though no less insistent, as they drafted statutes to enforce clerical marriages and to outlaw popish ceremonies. Opposing them stood the conservative Catholic faction, determined to preserve as much of the old ecclesiastical order as possible. They whispered in corridors of Somerset's palace at Greenwich, warning that abrupt reform would alienate hearts and minds. Perhaps even spark rebellion. They extolled the continuity of ancient rites and argued that a judicious return to familiar practices would stabilize the realm. Many valued the patronage once enjoyed under Catherine of Aragon and Mary's late mother, and they feared that the removal of sacred images and the tearing down of rood screens would irreparably fracture the spiritual fabric of the nation. Amid this struggle for religious supremacy, great noble houses circled like sharks, seeking advantage in the absence of an adult monarch. The Howards, long allied with Henry's final queen, Catherine Parr, manoeuvred to secure high offices and county stewardships. They offered their daughters' hands in marriage to promising courtiers and dangled alliances before Somerset's own relatives. Meanwhile, the Cromwell's kin, of the fate-turning Thomas Cromwell, who had once served Henry VIII, sought to regain lost influence. They cultivated sympathies on both sides of the religious divide, positioning themselves as indispensable mediators in a court grown wary of open conflict. Caught in this web were the king's 2 elder daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, though neither was in line for the throne at present. Both represented potent symbols of rival faiths. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, found herself embraced by Catholic stalwarts who lauded her devoutness and hoped she might one day restore the old religion. She was kept near the front of processions, her every gesture construed as a silent manifesto in favour of papal authority. In contrast, Elizabeth, born of Anne Boleyn, and thus entwined with the memory of the Reformation's spark, found her place among the more temperate Protestants. They lauded her upbringing at court, her education in humanist letters, and her measured responses to religious debate, seeing in her a hope for calm, moderate reform. In theory, the Regency Council held all the strings, steering the machinery of state in the name of King Edward. They passed edicts governing foreign policy, trade, and taxation. They convened sessions of Parliament to ratify these decisions, each act accompanied by speeches invoking the authority of the departed Henry VIII and the blessed boy who now wore the crown. But Henry's final will remained. The ultimate touchstone, buried within its dense legalese, were clauses that bound the council to uphold his established statutes and to secure the succession as he had decreed. No measure could be enacted without deference to his explicit directives, and so even the most ambitious councillor tread carefully, lest he be accused of contravening the late king's sacred testament. For the people of England, this period of transition felt like the stillness before a storm. They remembered the early days of Henry's reign, those bright afternoons in the hunting parks, the trumpets heralding grand tournaments, the belief that their young king embodied the promise of a new renaissance. Yet they also recoiled at the memory of his final years, the decay of his body, the stench of his festering wounds, the swift executions that had left the realm shivering in fear. Stories circulated in alehouses and market squares, tales of monks dragged screaming from their cloisters, of nobles vanishing overnight, of illicit masses held in secret by candlelight. These recollections infused the air with a tense anticipation, as though every breath might signal the next upheaval. The nation lay deeply divided, no longer merely along regional lines, but along the fissures of faith and family. In the north, where Catholic sentiment ran strong, discontent smouldered even after the pilgrimage of grace had been extinguished. Small gatherings in manor houses kept alive the old rites, and whispers suggested a second uprising, if Protestant measures grew too harsh. In the south and east, where the new Book of Common Prayer had taken root, merchants printed pamphlets praising the virtues of the Reformation and warning of the idolatry beneath the ancient crosses. This schism set the stage for a decade of unrest and intrigue. Earlships changed hands as councillors fell from grace. Lawsuits over confiscated church lands clogged the courts. Regional rebellions flared and were swiftly put down by Somerset's forces. Foreign ambassadors, the French, the Spanish, the imperial envoys sent dispatches filled with speculation. Would Edward's government falter or flourish? Could a boy of 9 withstand such storms? Guided by a council at once, divided and divided again. Each letter, each treaty negotiation, each request for trade privileges became a chess move in a game whose board was the English realm itself. Thus, in the waning light of a January morning, the seeds of future conflict were sown. The Regency Council, appointed to guard the young king's throne, found itself both master and captive of Henry VIII's legacy. Mary and Elizabeth, once mere princesses, became living embodiments of contested religious futures. Noble houses jockeyed for advantage, while commoners dared not voice their hopes or fears above a whisper, and through it all, the realm held its breath, awaiting a turn of fate that would decide whether England would march boldly into a new age or slump back into the shadows of its turbulent past. Henry VIII bequeathed to England a legacy as grand as it was stained with blood. On one hand, he founded the Church of England, severing ties with Rome and arrogating to himself the title of supreme head. He dissolved the monasteries, confiscating their vast treasures and lands, funneling gold into the royal coffers. At sea, he ordered the construction of a powerful navy, laying the keel for what would, in centuries to come, become the backbone of England's maritime empire. Yet for every monastery stripped of its altar silver, for every ship launched into the Channel's waters, there was a darker counterweight. Henry's reign was marked by terror. Thousands were executed under his commands. Scores of noble houses were stripped of titles and imprisoned in the Tower of Westminster, and the common people suffered under heavy taxes and loss of social services once provided by the dissolved religious houses. Famine stalked the land, and disease spread through towns, reeling from displacement and insecurity. Generations have since debated whether Henry VIII was a reforming genius or a tyrant possessed. To his supporters, he was the visionary who freed England from the political machinations of the papacy, who centralized power in the monarchy and funded a navy that protected the realm from foreign fleets. They celebrate his achievements in law, his patronage of the arts, and his establishment of a national church that would go on to shape English identity for centuries. Yet his detractors point to the rivers of blood that marked his path: the cold execution of Anne Boleyn on trumped-up charges, the brutal suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace, and the arbitrary downfall of noblemen who once stood at his side. They argue that his reforms were imposed at the barrel of a gun, that his currency was fear, and that his greatest legacy was the lesson that unchecked power can warp even the noblest intentions. The most enduring lesson from Henry's tumultuous life may well be, this power, without restraint, can transform a man of vision into a monster. His pursuit of absolute authority over church, nobility, and populace unleashed forces that consumed not only his adversaries, but ultimately eroded his own body and spirit. His insatiable appetite for glory demanded sacrifice. That hunger never sated. It chewed away at his humanity until he lay dying in a bed of rot and regret. His final years, defined by paranoia and physical decay, stand as a stark reminder that the trappings of greatness crowns armies. Royal proclamations cannot protect one from the frailty of flesh or the inexorable approach of mortality. Though more than 5 centuries have passed since his death, the figure of Henry VIII remains an arresting symbol of the paradox of rulership. He was at once magnificent and monstrous, a king who commissioned grand palaces as stages for his triumphs, yet sentenced trusted friends to execution for the slightest perceived slight. He advanced religious reform yet punished dissenters with equal fervour. He led England into a new era of sovereignty, but did so under the heavy weight of his own tyranny. His life embodies the double-edged nature of sovereignty. A crown may grant dominion over a realm, but it cannot command the hand of death or the whims of the human heart. Today, when one strolls through the hallowed halls of Hampton Court, or gazes at the austere tomb of Henry and his beloved Jane Seymour at Windsor, one cannot help but feel the echo of his contradictions. The very stones, weathered though they be, seem to whisper of feasts and executions, of theological debates and secret liaisons. His portrait, with its broad shoulders and piercing gaze, captures the man who dreamed of absolute power, yet fell victim to the same temporal constraints he sought to transcend. Henry's legacy is woven into the fabric of British history. The Church of England he founded persists, its Book of Common Prayer still read in cathedrals. The Royal Navy he championed grew into the greatest maritime force of an empire upon which the sun never set. But alongside these achievements lies the shadow of his cruelty, the shattered monasteries that once fed the poor, the families torn apart by accusations of treason, and the lingering cautionary tale that power, once unleashed, can run riot. In the end, the story of Henry VIII serves as a timeless admonition. It warns rulers and ruled alike that the pursuit of absolute glory, be it through reform, conquest, or spectacle, carries with it the seeds of destruction. Authority, unless tempered by compassion and bound by principle, will devour its wielder. And so, while historians may quarrel over the balance of his accomplishments and his atrocities, they cannot deny the resonance of his reign, a vivid illustration of how a single man, crowned by birth and ambition, can reshape a nation, and in doing so, become ensnared by the very power he sought to command. As age and ailment gnawed steadily at his strength, Henry VIII withdrew ever deeper into a shroud of paranoia. The vibrant monarch who once revelled in feasts and tournaments now obsessed over whispers in shadowed corridors. He decreed that no gesture, no murmur, no exchange of glances amongst his courtiers should escape his scrutiny. From the softest critique of a musician's lute to the furtive glances exchanged by dukes and earls, every nuance of court life became fodder for his growing distrust. Secret agents, inserted into every wing of Whitehall, prowled the tapestry-hung passages. They lurked behind velvet drapes and lingered near candlelit portrait galleries, their presence unseen yet palpably menacing. Should any soul be labelled disloyal or deemed to lack sufficient reverence, their name was quietly inscribed on the dreaded Black Book, the regal inventoried list of death that would consign them to the Tower at the next royal whim. From the year 1540 onwards, the Tower of London transformed into a grim, honourable prison for men once lauded by Henry's favour. Sir Thomas Cromwell, the architect of much of Henry's reign, found himself bereft of title and comfort, his estates forfeit and his family exiled from court. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, whose lineage had once intertwined with Tudor destiny, lay shackled in the same cold stone chamber. Even abbots and priors, leaders of monasteries whose dissolution had lined the king's treasury, were dragged from cloister and chapter house, accused of secret sedition. Executioner's block and confiscation were but two prongs of Henry's punishment. Wealth was seized, heirs' inheritance erased, families uprooted and driven into the hinterlands. Within this maelstrom of suspicion, factions jockeyed ceaselessly for influence. Courtiers formed alliances like spiderwebs, each silken thread a promise or a betrayal. Those who once whispered words of praise at the king's banquets now tiptoed around his table, conscious of every breath that might offend his delicate nerves. Policies once debated with rhetorical flourish in council chambers were now issued as royal commands, delivered with the weight of a blade hovering over the neck of every servant and statesman. Foreign embassies learned to whisper compliments through carefully chosen emissaries, for any tone of criticism might be construed as complicit in some imaginary conspiracy. As Henry lay night after night upon his inclined bed, the stench of his festering ulcer mingled with the melancholy air of his private chamber. He battled nightmares that would chill the hearts of lesser men. In dreams, or perhaps in fevered visions, he found himself surrounded by traitors, the face of Edward Seymour distorted into a sneer, the image of Sir William Paget muttering betrayal, and the ghostly spectre of Anne Boleyn accusing him of cruelty. He awoke with gasps, his heart pounding so fiercely that even the physicians dared not approach without caution. In those pre-dawn hours, he rose from his ropes and pulleys just long enough to bark orders to rewrite his will again and again, each iteration to sever the root of evil that might ensnare his kingdom after his passing. Though he had already affixed his seal to legal tomes and sealed last testamentary directives in well-guarded chests, Henry could not resist issuing fresh commands to his scribes. By candlelight, he hovered over scrolls, retracing words in his spidery script and scrawling marginalia that barred any who sought to subvert the peace from succeeding to lands or titles. Each clause tightened the circle around his legacy, binding young Edward's regency to an unbreakable chain of oaths and penalties. Yet in the same breath, he lapsed into impassioned prayer, tears slipping down his cheeks as he pleaded for deliverance from unseen foes. In the hushed hours before dawn, Catherine Parr, ever vigilant, would find him inwardly quaking. She witnessed his trembling hands hovering over parchment and heard his low whispers invoking God's mercy while commanding fleets and councils to uphold Tudor dominion. Her own role in these nocturnal rituals was equal parts nurse and confidant. She would smooth the king's damp brow, offer him warming broth to ease his trembling lips, and gently speak reminders of his own mortality. Yet she too carried the burden of silence, for to comfort him was peril when any word might betray a dissenting thought. Thus the final days of Henry VIII unfolded under the twin shadows of physical decay and mental strife. His bedchamber became the heart of a kingdom besieged by its own anxieties, where the pulse of state affairs throbbed in time with the faint flutter of his feeble heartbeat. Messengers arrived with petitions, only to be dismissed with a curt command or a venomous glare, their hopes for favour evaporating in the dusty gloom. Edicts proclaimed to the realm from the throne of his council bore his faint cipher, reminding all that the ghost of Henry's authority still watched, still judged. In those twilight hours, the very concept of succession became an obsession. Henry questioned Edward's resilience. Would the boy king possess the fortitude to inherit such a turbulent realm? He pondered, recalling Mary or Elizabeth to the line of command, should Edward falter. Each scenario stirred the coals of potential conflict anew, fueling the fire of his sleepless nights. The spectre of civil war flickered before his eyes, conjured by memories of past uprisings, until, at last, he fell back into fevered sleep, his brows drawn together as though preparing to confront yet another host of invisible traitors. So passed the end of Henry's reign, not with the roar of battlefield clarion, nor the trumpeted procession of a great funeral parade, but with the quiet scratching of quills, the rustle of parchment, and the stifled breathing of a court held hostage by its king's fear. Each dawn brought no relief, only the promise of another day in which power's hungry shadows stalked the corridor like silent assassins. and though his body lay broken by infection and his mind fractured by suspicion, his will remained unbowed, scribbling last commands in his own bloodless hand, an eternal testament to the perilous dance between authority and paranoia. The upheaval in Henry VIII's final days reverberated far beyond his own suffering, casting a long, dark shadow over his royal family. Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife, survived the king's death. Yet she bore scars no chronicler could fully record. She had tended him in his last agonizing hours, braved the stench of his festering wounds, and heard the labored rasp of his final breaths. Her position was precarious. She was both consort and caretaker, expected to display unwavering composure, even as grief and revulsion warred within her, though she lived on to marry Sir Thomas Seymour and to foster the young Edward. History remembers Catherine Parr chiefly as the steadfast figure who kept the court from descending into complete chaos during those perilous months. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, assumed the title of Lord Protector, and 9-year-old Edward VI became the youngest monarch in English history. Overnight, the once carefree boy found himself the focal point of palace intrigue and national expectation. He was instructed in the complex laws of succession, schooled in statecraft by scrawny-faced tutors, and obliged to sit in on council meetings where grave decisions were made in his name. In these early sessions of the Regency Council, Edward learned quickly that a king's word, even a boy king's, held enormous weight, yet youth's fragile psyche recoiled at the rumours that wafted through the corridors, whispers of his father's brutality. Tales of Anne Boleyn's execution, Anne of Cleves's abrupt annulment, and Catherine Howard's ignominious fall. The burden of legacy pressed upon him so swiftly that he had little choice but to shed some semblance of childhood and adopt the airs of a sovereign far beyond his tender years. Meanwhile, Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, Edward's elder half-sister, and elder half-sister by different mothers, found themselves transformed from princesses, sheltered in nursery towers, into symbols of divergent futures. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was now the standard-bearer of the old Catholic faith, her very name invoked in secret masses held in hidden chapels. To many northern nobles and devout villagers, Mary represented loyalty, tradition, and resistance to the sweeping reforms that had dismantled monastic life. They admired her stoic devotion and whispered that she might one day restore the altars and relics that Henry had torn down. Elizabeth, though younger than Mary by 2 years, occupied a more precarious position. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, she was a living emblem of the Reformation's birth pangs, her education in humanist classics Greek, Latin, rhetoric made her a favourite among moderate reformers who prized her intellect and poise. Yet every syllable she spoke was weighed against the fear that she might court the wrong faction or utter a heresy that could cost her freedom or worse. Elizabeth's survival in such treacherous waters speaks to her uncanny ability to navigate with grace. She learned to cloak her opinions in neutrality, to offer courteous smiles when faced with veiled threats, and to register her own devotions in private prayers rather than public declarations. For Mary and Elizabeth, the court's atmosphere of distrust was an indoctrination in politics more severe than any university curriculum. Both girls saw guardians and governesses come and go, often replaced by others, chosen for their alignment with one faction or another. The very tapestries that lined their chambers were sometimes swapped to display new royal mottos, reminding them of the king's fluctuating allegiances. In whispered late-night conversations, they shared fears. Mary worried about the loss of her mother's memory, and Elizabeth about the precariousness of her own claim and her mother's fate. Yet these shared confidences were hushed beneath closed doors, for loose lips could lead to suspicion and arrest. As Edward VI assumed the throne, Mary's supporters hoped she would find a place of influence, but she was bound by Henry's will and the council's ironclad statutes. Elizabeth's patrons believed in her promise, but dared not advocate too loudly for fear of jeopardizing her safety. The two sisters, once simply members of the royal household, now embodied the spiritual and political fault lines that cut through England. Their childhoods ended in the gloaming of Henry VIII's passing, replaced by an education in survival, how to interpret a royal glance, how to master the art of measured reply, and how to preserve oneself in a world where allegiance could change as swiftly as the wind. Thus, in the aftermath of Henry VIII's demise, Catherine Parr stepped back from the centre stage into a quieter life of remarriage and motherhood, leaving behind memories of her gentle stewardship. Young King Edward VI sat beneath the heavy velvet drapes of the council chamber, learning that power was a chain as much as it was a crown. Princess Mary stood in candlelit chapels, whispering Latin prayers for the day the old faith would rise again. Princess Elizabeth, slender and watchful, practiced her letters and poetry, storing in secret the seeds of a leadership that would one day bloom in a different age. In those years of transition, the royal family bore witness to the profound cost of the Tudors' reign, a family forged in splendour and ambition, yet forever marked by tragedy and rivalry. The inheritance Henry VIII left them was not only a throne, not only a church, not only a navy, but also a nation tethered to the memory of his greatness and the horror of his excess. To navigate this inheritance, Catherine Parr, Edward VI, Mary, and Elizabeth cultivated qualities the king himself had never mastered: compassion, moderation, and discretion, each of which would shape their own places in history in ways Henry's sword and crown never could. With Henry VIII gone, the Regency Council under the leadership of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, moved with deliberate resolve to press forward the cause of Protestant reform. The Church of England shed more of its medieval trappings, aligning itself ever more closely with the currents of continental Europe. Surviving monasteries, once spared in the king's initial wave of dissolutions, were now dismantled, their lands and treasures folded into the royal treasury. Old missals and Catholic prayer books were withdrawn from circulation, locked away or burned in small bonfires on the palace forecourts. The buzz of hammers on stone and the rustle of parchment gave way to the quiet rustling of newly printed texts in English, urging the faithful to read scripture unmediated by Latin clergy. Yet in the shadow of these reforms, a determined conservative faction rallied around Princess Mary. She, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and the embodiment of the old faith, lent her name to those who preferred the ancient rites. They met in secret within the damp crypts of country churches and the hidden alcoves of old abbey walls, whispering prayers in candlelight and venerating images that the new bishops declared heretical. Their resistance was cautious at first, a furtive sign of the cross here, a discreet Latin chant there, but it grew bolder as Somerset's agents enforced the new statutes. The political struggle deepened into a pitched battle of influence. Reformist leaders, many of whom had served Henry VIII's final years, now assumed prominent offices. The young Archbishop Cranmer drafted new liturgies, while evangelical courtiers lobbied for the seizure of remaining church plate. Opponents accused them of sacrilege and warned that souls would be lost to eternal damnation. In response, the reformers taunted their adversaries as agents of Rome, clinging to an outdated tyranny of popes and relics. Secret letters flew between noble houses, each invoking God's will as justification for plots of power or pleas for mercy. In the midst of this turmoil, King Edward VI, though barely a boy, sought to assert his own authority. He attended council meetings with sober expression, nodding in agreement at times and frowning in perplexity at others. He implored his councillors to temper zeal with compassion, to seek reconciliation between the two camps. He spoke of unity, of mending the rift his father had wrought. Though the weight of memory lay heavy on him, his voice, though young, carried a sincerity that sometimes gave even hardened lords pause. Yet the chasm wrought by Henry VIII's legacy proved deep. Landless former monks and displaced priests nursed resentments, while evangelical preachers, emboldened by state sanction, denounced lingering Catholic sympathies as treasonous. Border regions saw skirmishes between armed retainers of either persuasion, and in market towns, merchants feared to speak openly of faith for fear of informers. The process of secularizing the church, once a brilliant assertion of royal supremacy, now haunted the realm, leaving wounds that would take generations to heal. Thus, under the regency of Somerset and the watchful eyes of a boy king, England wavered between two futures, one forged in the fires of Reformation, the other anchored in the traditions of the past. The shimmering promise of a modernized church clashed with the steadfast devotion of those who mourned its dissolution, and as Edward VI grappled with duties beyond his years, the nation held its breath, awaiting a resolution to a contest born of his father's ambition and sustained by the restless spirits of both reformer and recusant. Many years later, the figure of Henry VIII remained vivid in the public imagination. The dashing king, the ruthless tyrant, the bold reformer, chronicles penned by court scribes alternated between lavish praise of his patronage of the arts and scathing reproaches for his bloody reprisals. Diplomatic correspondence bore witness to foreign envoys' awe at his splendor alongside their horror at his swift executions. Folk tales passed down in village hearths spoke in hushed tones of the bloody Tudor. A monarch who commissioned grand tapestries depicting mythic heroes, yet ordered loyal counsellors beheaded at the mere hint of disloyalty. In the collective memory, Henry's reign crystallized into a series of stark contradictions. One moment, England's courts reverberated with the strains of lute and viol in celebration of humanist learning. The next, they echoed with the clang of the executioner's axe and the terrified murmur of condemned monks. His architectural commissions, marble columns, and stained glass windows stood alongside the skeletal ruins of once thriving abbeys, silent witnesses to a reform that liberated the church, even as it impoverished the poor. The horror of his final hours became legend in its own right. Tales told of the leaden coffin, swelling and weeping foul fluid, of hounds drawn by the stink, who licked at the drips beneath moonlit abbey arches. This grotesque image assumed symbolic power far beyond its grisly reality. It came to stand for the tragic cost of unchecked sovereignty. A crown might confer the authority to govern a realm, but it could not shield its wearer from the frailty of flesh, nor prevent the corruption that seeps into power when accountability is abandoned. Historians counsel that Henry's life is an eternal lesson, a reminder of the perilous boundary between firm governance and unbridled tyranny, between the glory of achievement and the abyss of despair. In his early years, he embodied the promise of a Renaissance prince athletic, erudite, ambitious, yet as he aged, his ambitions devoured his humanity, leaving behind a hollow shell haunted by pain and paranoia. His story warns that even the most visionary leader, in pursuit of absolute authority, risks becoming a monster to those he once inspired. Thus, the legacy of Henry VIII endures not merely in stone and parchment, but in the moral cautionary tale he became. The courtiers who survived his reign spoke of him with a mixture of reverence and dread, and their descendants passed on the memory, ensuring that every generation confronted the question, at what cost does power demand loyalty? And when does loyalty demand the sacrifice of conscience? Even today, when one strolls through the shadowy cloisters of a former abbey or admires a Tudor portrait's resplendent velvet and jewels, the silent undertow of Henry's turmoil whispers, "Remember the line where control ends and tyranny begins, lest you find yourself devoured by the very power you sought to wield." The story of Henry VIII's turbulent life is not merely a royal tragedy, but also carries profound values and messages for its audience. First, this video reminds us that power, if left unchecked and unbalanced, can easily turn a great man into a monster. Henry VIII was once a promising prince of the Renaissance era. Yet through the process of seizing and consolidating absolute power, he allowed ambition to blind him. This led to bloody marriages, purges of his court, and ultimately, a horrific death in pain and loneliness. Second, his journey vividly illustrates the fragility of body and soul. in the face of time and illness. A king once mighty and vigorous was betrayed by his own flesh, forced to rely on pulleys, gasp for breath, and lives surrounded by the stench of his ulcer. This reminds each of us that no matter how powerful or wealthy we may be, our bodies and spirits have immutable limits, and true happiness does not come from a throne or a treasury, but from care, peace, and compassion. Third, the video encourages viewers to revisit history with a critical spirit. Although Henry VIII left behind landmark religious and military reforms, his harsh actions caused suffering for thousands of people. Dissolving the monasteries may have enriched the royal coffers, but it also drained vital social support, pushing the poor into dire straits. Thus, every major decision must be weighed not only for its immediate benefits, but also for its long-term consequences and its humanitarian impact. Finally, this story invites us to cherish the balance between power and ethics. As we reflect on the highs and lows of the Tudor dynasty, we should ask ourselves, are we using our power or influence to improve lives, or merely to assert our egos? Do we dare confront our own limitations and heed the voice of conscience? Or do we indulge in authority while forgetting our responsibilities? Through this video, we learn that great power carries great responsibility, and that no matter how strong someone appears, they cannot escape fate or the fragility of the human condition. Above all, the history of Henry VIII stands as an eternal warning. Glory can turn into tragedy without compassion and self-restraint.